the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, inertialess objects seen flitting about nuclear carriers on new Navy UFO videos turn out to be time-traveling transhuman imps from Uptime playing on their big brothers' Ataris. Plus, we continue the complete audiobook serialization of David Weber's Uncompromising Honor, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. We talked to Eric Flint and Dave Freer this time about the fourth entry in the Witches of Karres series, The Shaman of Karres. This is Eric Flint and Dave Freer's continuation of the James Schmitz series, with Mercedes Lackey contributing to the first sequel as well. This book is a real finale sort of tale, with lots of the various storylines wrapping up, and the Lewitt, who has been just a wee manipulator of the laws of space and time in the first books, coming into her own in The Shaman of Karres. The book also features a horrifying take on space slavery, where the slaves are chemically manipulated to be utterly devoted to their oppressors. Plus, there's lots of cool SF wonder-inducing ideas, especially with the xenobiology in the book, because Dave Freer was, for many years, a biologist specializing in marine animals, and he comes up with some cool stuff. Plus, we continue the complete audiobook serialization of David Weber's Honor Harrington series masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. Now here's the news. The May hardcovers and original trade paperbacks have entered the chute and are aching to stampede away, so grab your lassos, readers, and get ready to rope those steers. Out in May is The Shaman of Karres by Eric Flint and Dave Freer. Starship Captain Paussert and the Witches of Karres must deal with a slaver culture that makes slaves feel happy to be in chains, and the youngest of the witches, the Lewitt, begins to awaken to her full powers as a healer. We'll talk with Dave and Eric about that much more in just a moment. Also out now is Penrick's Travel by Lois McMaster Bujold. Footloose nobleman Penrick grows wiser and even more wily as he journeys from young lord to sorcerer and scholar in the Bastard's Order. Oh, and he deals with intrigue and solves mysteries along the way as well. 3 stories of epic fantasy from the new Sephwa Grandmaster, Lois McMaster Bujold. It includes Penrick's Mission, Mira's Last Dance, and The Prisoner of Lemnos. We talked to Lois about this back in February when the first collection of these novellas came out, and this is the second 3 of those that will complete the issuing of these novellas in book form. And finally out in May is The 11th Gate by Nancy Crest. When war breaks out between the city-states of the 8 worlds, the key to victory and peace lies with 2 unlikely allies. Through the 11th star-jump gate, at the end of which lies a planet of danger and mystery. The 11th Gate by Nancy Crest. Penrick's Travels by Lois McMaster Bujold, and The Shaman of Karres by Eric Flint and Dave Freer are now at booksellers everywhere, or will be next Tuesday. Get them, read them, and have a wonderful blooming May of fantasy and science fiction excellence. Want to welcome Eric Flint and Dave Freer back to the podcast. Hello, guys. Thank you so much for showing up.
Hi.
Good day.
Eric Flint is a modern master of alternate history fiction with over 3 million books in print. He's the author-creator of the multiple New York Times best-selling Ring of Fire series, starting with 1632, and he's written popular novels in the Belisarius series and with David Weber, who's collaborated on both some 1632 Ring of Fire books, and Eric has collaborated on that great Honorverse sub-series, Crown of Slaves, including Cauldron of Ghosts. That was the last one. Eric's latest Ring of Fire novel is what? It's not Polish Maelstrom.
Yeah, it is.
It is?
No, I'm sorry. In the 1632 series?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Polish Maelstrom's the last one that I'm trying to think.
That's 1630s.
Came out. The next one coming out. No, wait a minute.
That one with
China
Walt.
Venture came out after that. Yeah. 1636, the China Venture, I believe, is the last one that's been published. There's another one coming out in August and another one in November.
Yeah. And Eric was for many years a labor union activist, and he lives in Chicago, Illinois. Dave Freer is an ichthyologist turned author who lives on Flinders Island between mainland Australia and Tasmania with his wife, 4 dogs, and 4 cats. Are your sons still living there? Or are they?
One's in Cambridge, UK, and the other one is in South Australia.
So he's out there with the fish and his wife. Yes, co-authored a range of novels with Eric Flint, like the Rats, Bats, and Vats series, Pyramid Scheme series. I'm not sure what the series is called. And a wonderful book called Slow Train to Arcturus, which is, I think that's a one-off, right? It's this cool...
Yeah, that wasn't part of the series.
Yeah, it's like a
David
cool...
and I have done, I believe, I think Shaman of Karres marks the 11th book we've done together, including a few we also did with Misty Lackey. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, you've done the Shadow of the Lion, This Rough Magic, the Heirs of Alexander series, and then you and David done the Wizard of Karres series, which this is the third of, right? It's
the third sequel. Yeah, there's 4 all told if you include Witches of Karres.
Yeah, which is.
And the next one was Wizard of Karres, which we did with Misty Lackey, and then the last 2. Sorcerer of Karres and Shaman of Karres, which is just coming out. Dave and I did just the 2 of us.
Right. And David's solo works include Dragon's Ring and Dog and Dragon, really cool fantasy novels, and Changeling's Island, which is a really cool young adult novel that people really should check out. I think it's a wonderful book set on Flinders Island.
Yeah, that one got to be a finalist in 2 categories in the Dragon Awards.
Yeah, and right now out at booksellers everywhere is The Shaman of Karres, or The Shaman of Karres, however you want to say it, by Eric Flint and Dave Freer. And this is the third book in the series that you two and Misty Lackey wrote the first one, then you wrote next 2, but the first one was written not by any of you, right? It was a book that you had...
written by James Schmitz. He wrote it in the late 60s, so it's been 50 years ago.
Yeah. So what did you admire so much about that, and why are you writing sequels to it? Give us some background on this.
Well, I've been a really big James A. Schmitz fan since I was a kid. I talked Jim Bain into reissuing his works. He died in 1981, so he's been gone a long time. And Jim agreed to do 4 volumes initially, which were all the stories set in the Federation of the Hub, which was Schmitz's sort of main common setting he used for a lot of his stories. And then those sales went well, so we completed all of his work. That took another 3 volumes, of which the third and last was Wizard of Karres, which Jim was twitchy about publishing Wizard of Karres because he'd done the last reissue of it shortly after Bain Books had been established, and it pretty well tanked. But when we reissued it, it sold quite well. I think the reason that his reissue tanked was just because it just wasn't long enough after Schmitz had died. You know, you got to let a certain amount of time go by, let the nostalgia build up, so to speak. But Witches of Karres is just a wonderful story. It was his longest novel, and he only wrote 4 novels. And actually, Witches of Karres, it successfully passed itself off as a novel, but what it really was 3 novelettes and a novella sort of, braided together. if you actually look at it, they're all separate adventures. You could remove any one of them, and the book would still hold together. And I remember reading when I was a teenager, and I loved the book. And when we got the rights to Schmitz's estate, one of the things we got was a right to write work set in any of his universes. So we decided we would, do a sequel to Witches of Karres, which is the Wizard of Karres, which Dave and I did with Mercedes Lackey. And that did quite well, and so Dave, Misty peeled off at that point, but Dave and I did the next one, Sorcerer of Karres, which also did well, and we'll see how Shaman does. Part of the reason we wanted to do Shaman was because there's a sort of necessary story arc if you go beyond the first book and start writing sequels, then you face a major dramatic problem or issue, which is that the heart of the story is the relationship between Captain Paussert and Goth. And that's tricky because when they meet, he's in his mid-20s and Goth is 10 years old, and she sort of immediately announces she's going to marry him when she gets old enough. Well, Schmitz ended the book right about, when they're both at that age, and that was the end of it. But if you're going to keep going with the story, which Dave and I did, then you've got the awkward problem that at the very center of it is what amounts to a romance between an adult male and a 10-year-old girl, which is tricky, to put it mildly. And I think we successfully pulled it off, but we needed to get through Shaman of Karres in order to do it. And I don't know, Dave, do you agree with me?
Yeah, I thought that using a bit of time travel in, what was it, Wizard, yeah, so that we got Goth to actually deal with a younger Paussert.
Yeah, that was a nice.
Actually helped to shift the characters around a bit, yeah.
Yeah, that was Dave's idea, and it worked very, very well. Because it enabled us to sort of have them meet each other when they're about the same age. And then, although Captain Paussert doesn't at the time realize who she is, and he doesn't realize who she is later when he counts her. But yeah, it's a nice. That's done in Sorcerers of Karres, the third book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So basically, this is so you needed to do a little time travel to make sure that we didn't have a pederasty subplot.
Yeah.
But
yeah, you've got a very awkward problem there.
Yeah. But what it is a story about a spaceship captain, a starship captain, and these three girls who are now becoming young women in Shaman of Karres, and they have special powers in this galactic. It's also feels so Andre Norton to me as well in a way.
It's got a close. It's got a same kind of feel to it. Yeah.
And they have sort of psionic powers or the powers that are super science. And this guy needs to protect them, and at the same time, they're extremely powerful beings. Can you sort of explain the milieu and the background and how it's not magic, how the Katha and all the other...
The way Schmitz himself described the book he wrote, The Witches of Karres, the Foundation novel, he described it as science fantasy. It is officially science fiction because it claims to be, but the class of powers, as they're called, I'm not actually even sure how you pronounce that. Could I suppose be pronounced I don't know. I pronounce it Clatha. It's supposedly some kind of geez, Dave, I don't know what you call it. In practice, it's like magic, but officially it's not. It's some natural force in the universe.
Yeah, I always took it as kind of being able to interact with other dimensions and therefore draw various things from them rather than so much as magic but it definitely has elements of the whole side.
It's a little bit like the Force in the Star Wars universe, It's like, what the hell is the Force, Well, we're just not going to worry too much about that, and we'll just take it as it is. And
it's great space opera.
Yeah. But each of the girls has a different talent. What are those talents? Who are the girls and what are those talents? We maybe start with the Lewitt.
Well, she's the main character for the last book, so I think we should probably start with Goth.
Yes.
Who's who can teleport things and who can also read histories of the past by touching things. So, strong emotions, so leave an impression on solid objects. This house feels like it's got a history, etc. That feeling. Well, that was a play on that. The Lewitt's abilities seem very limited in the first book. She's just
back up. You forgot one, which is Goth also can manipulate light, so she can effectively make herself invisible for a period of time, or she can make herself appear to be someone else.
Or she can actually split the light into 4 people, which is quite useful at times. And then the Lewitt's first abilities in the first book is she has these ultrasonic whistles, which can break things at audible range and that kind of thing. This gradually develops throughout the books, and her ability then turns out to be a healing ability where she can actually touch the patient and reach into them and explore them at a cellular level and treat things. But of course, she's still a young girl, and medicine is pretty hard on anybody who's quite a lot older than that, and she's having to deal with that, the enormous power that potentially gives her both, to cure people and also possibly to kill them.
The third sister's off doing something in this book,
That's
right?
Moline. Yeah, I honestly don't even remember what her power was, because she only really appears, and then just briefly in the very first book, Witches of Karres. Captain Paussert rescues the 3 witches. They're all sisters in the first book early on, and Moline is the oldest of them, but she peels away very, very quickly and really plays no further part. She's referred to occasionally, but she plays no further part in the story. It's really the 2 younger sisters, Goth and the Lewitt, who are at the center of the story, along with Captain Paussert. Those are the 3 central characters.
Yeah.
There are other, prominent characters like Hulido, Aldo, and some others, but the 3 central characters to the series are Captain Paussert and the 2 younger of the sisters. Goth is the middle sister, and the Lewitt is the youngest.
Yeah. Now the Lewitt is her power seems less at first, but it really is the more powerful of the 2. This ability to heal and to really reach inside, understand processes, and she can even read resonances from material, right, and figure out a history of something.
Well, no, that's Goth.
Oh, is that Goth?
Goth is the one who can do that. She can basically just put her hand, touch some, surface, like the wall of a room, and she can, if there's a history there, especially if it's an unpleasant history, she can detect it, so to speak, and understands at least some of what happened.
And Goth can also just she can teleport a gun out of your hand and have it in her hand if you're threatening.
I'm not sure. There's a weight restriction. Dave, is she capable of teleporting?
There's definitely a weight and a range restriction. As she's got better at right at the end of the final book, she actually manages to teleport whole people. Her father, in their earlier books, shows his ability. So it's kind of a developmental thing. And it seems to be, the way Schmitz wrote it, to be a stepwise thing. So you go from low ability to making quite a big step up and so on, instead of a gradual progression.
We should also mention that Captain Paussert also turns out to be a witch of Karres, although that takes the whole first book to develop. But by the end of the first book, it turns out he also has the ability to manipulate some Clotha powers, and that power of his develops in the course of the series.
Yeah, and it plays a big part in this book.
So by the time you get to the Shaman of Karres, which is the fourth book, he's quite a powerful witch in his own right.
Yeah. So what does it mean to be a witch? All right, there's this entire planet of people, and it is that have powers like this. And it struck me, it feels like something like Isaac Asimov's Foundation, the second Foundation. They are trying to influence things in this shaky galactic empire and trying to make a better world emerge or something like that. Can you explain a little bit about the backstory of all this?
Go ahead, Dave.
I'm trying to think of an easy way out of this one. I drew my inspiration for this from Schmitz's other work, where he has this whole overarching organizational type thing, trying to foster the survival of humanity for starters. That's a big theme in all of the Karres books, is that they're dealing with things which could potentially go very, very badly for everybody. In the last one in particular, we're dealing with humanity being its own enemy as well as other things. The Karres witches do not, generally speaking, micromanage in any way. They do have precogs, so they can predict which way the future might go unless some form of intervention takes place. They don't usually know exactly how that's going to work out once you start changing things. And their whole attitude generally is, well, let them get on with it. But every now and again, there's a point when you can't just let them get on with it. Would that be a fair take, Eric?
The origins of Karres is never, it's always awfully vague in Schmitz. They did originate from Earth way back when. Where exactly the Clotha powers came from, nobody really knows, although it does have a strong genetic component. And they created their own planet of Karres, which they can actually move using their powers. It takes a whole lot of working together, but they can move the planet. So the planet moves around. And it's hard to describe. It's kind of like this. You can think of the planet Karres and its inhabitants as this kind of cross between sort of private eye who's going around straightening out problems and a sort of version of Hogwarts, only it's mostly teachers instead of students, but they're constantly getting involved in brawls with wicked and evil forces in the universe, of which there are quite a few. The political background is it's quite different from the Federation of the Hub, which is the main setting that Schmitz created. He did over half his work in that setting. In the Karres universe, there is a one big empire in it. And Karres has good relations with one of the princesses. And there are, cannibal pirates, and there's an immensely evil power from from another universe. It's Melander. It or he is the chief villain in the first book, The Witches of Karres. It's a very rich background he created, but it's easy to work with because it's he just kind of put it together as he went. I mean, there's no there's kind of a lot of elbow room to work in that universe. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, the Empire is definitely defined as. The Empire is definitely defined as mostly good, but that was only compared to the chaos that went before it, which Schmidt sort of brings up a little bit of. It's a very complicated series of books now that you're asking us to describe in very few words.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the book, Paussert and the Lewitt get sent out on a mission, on a mission that they're not exactly sure what the mission is. They're told they're told an assignment. At the same time, Goth, who is Paussert's love interest, and as he is hers, she's sent out in another direction. What are the initial assignments here, and why were they sent?
Well, part of the whole point of separating the two there was to work on the relationship between the two of them, and to get them to square up where they stood as far as the other person was concerned. And Goth's mission is to find Paussert's mother, which they know if Paussert was told that his mother was in potential strife, he would leave his mission and go off and do that. Paussert's mission is to stop a war. So he says, I'm to intervene on this side because the other guys are real bad slavers. And the peacocks have to say, no. He says, I'm to intervene on the slavers' side. And the peacocks have to say, no, we don't know what you have to do. But neither side winning would be a good thing. So it's a story which develops about a set of people who have a particularly nasty way of enslaving people, in that they make the slave utterly so devoted to its master by changing the biochemistry and mental reaction to the smell of the master, that the slave absolutely adores the master, will do anything for them, would literally die for their master and be happy doing it. But they are then sold to various clients, which a terrifying take on slavery, where the slave itself is not unhappy being a slave once it is made into a slave. And it raises all sorts of questions about, what does it mean? What is slavery? How do you free somebody from this? And when you do free them, they're actually desperately unhappy because they've been freed. You have to play around with that one quite a bit.
Yeah. But before they get put into this slavery, they certainly don't want to go into it. That's for sure.
No, they certainly don't want to go into it.
There's some people fighting against that.
It's not something you volunteer for. You are captured and taken and forced to become. But once you've actually been enslaved, there's really no easy way out of it. You can't just go and liberate the guy because he's actually terribly happy being a slave.
Yeah. Well, I must say, of course, we will not give out the ending, but you do come up with a wonderful twist on a possible solution to that I didn't even think of. So.
It was a neat twist, yeah. it's as if you had slavery where you could then
that,
give somebody a drug and they would be addicted to being a slave and would enjoy it. It's not exactly a drug. It kind of works that way. But, it's tricky because what Paussert discovers is that the slavers would seem to be the obvious villains, and they are, but the problem is their opponents are religious fanatics, and they're not, they're barely the lesser of two evils, and what the precogs say is they're actually the worst if it continues on. It's a tricky situation. And meanwhile, Goth's off having her own adventures. Which dramatically, we did the same thing in the third book. Dramatically, it was important to separate her from Paussert and have them go their separate ways, because if you had them just sticking together constantly, which is what happens in the original book, which is of Karres, and happens in the first sequel, Wizard of Karres. But, given this awkward issue of the romance between an adult and a child, you have to kind of separate them in order to have that work out properly, which we did in the third book and we did again in this book.
Yeah. Well, before Paussert gets to do anything, he and Lewitt come across some pirates who are slavers. How does that go, and how do they end up on this place called Cinderby's world, and what the heck is this world? Large part of the book takes place there.
So this world was Dave being a biologist again and trying to work out a reasonable way of making oxygen and tying the thread of where this ability to enslave people came from. And Cinderby's world is the cone, the end of the cone of worlds which this earlier alien power had developed. And Cinderby's world is really a way of imitating Karres' original things, where you have several minor short stories woven into a major novel. So I'm going to leave it at that for right now.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit about the ecosystem you came up with, because it's really kind of fascinating. So there's these big things that'll lay down on top of you and kill you. And
cheetahs, yeah.
And there's these little things that they're actually all at. The colonists there follow them around, and basically this is the oxygen exchange thing that all the spaceships use, right?
That's right, yeah. And it's basically a chemical catalyst which acts on what you're doing effectively is collecting the eggs from chickens, and the one lot are dropping the eggs for the other lot to fertilize and change. They're both the same species, they just don't look the same. And this is actually not that uncommon in biology, where you can find the two sexes looking vastly different, or life stages looking vastly different. You know that I am a very keen diver. Eric keeps talking about me molesting crayfish or spiny lobster down in holes that are 30 meters under the water and things like that, which is true enough. But I kind of use them as a model for this, because if you look at the younger version of the spiny lobster, it goes through about 5 or 6 instars, and the early ones look nothing at all like the later ones, and they have to go through certain developmental changes to get to the end of the sequence, which is why we've never really up to now managed to grow them artificially, because each of these things is so different and requires such different food in the size range and type and things like that. But synthesizing has been a real problem. In this case, I actually kept it simple and only had two particular life form shapes, but they are essentially the same animal, but the one actually travels around and collects minerals for its final stage of breeding, etc. And it's this mineral deposition, the eggs, as it were, that the other stage is trying to get to. And the humans are intervening by collecting the eggs. So think of it as a chicken farmer. If you take all the eggs, eventually you run out of chickens.
Yeah, and it's really a cool world. The humans that are working it don't completely understand what they're doing.
I mean, why would you, when you look at things which look so totally alien to each other? Best simple example I can think of is one of the squids, where for years they thought this thing they were finding in there was a squid worm and a parasite. It actually turned out to be the tentacle of the male, which got broken off. But nobody recognized it for what it was. It was a breeding tentacle. So it even has its own species name and things like that.
Wow. That is really creepy and cool.
Don't get me going.
Yeah, we use something sort of similar to it in Flint and Dave, where there's the aliens the ones we worked with were mobile and very much seem like humans, but they actually transform later in life into something very, very different.
And so
they become essentially sessile. I modeled that on some of the fish species, of course, because I have to be an ichthyologist somewhere down the line. And the advantages of one male can fertilize one hell of a lot of females, so you don't need a lot of males. So they can be this motile stage which moves around and does things and looks rather like humans. And then when they change over, they become very large and breed because the physiological demands of breeding are of carrying a baby, or in their case, eggs, is far higher than that just producing some sperm.
So Paussert...
Never get a biologist started on these things.
Yeah. It's fascinating. The way you work it into the book is really cool because, of course, it plays into the story, and it's just super, super cool ideas that deliver a sense of wonder. Paussert he attacks these pirates, frees all these people who are bound to be slaves, and takes them back to this world. And it's essentially it's a company town. And he immediately gets sued. Which...
You don't expect. I'm an ambulance officer on the island here, and some people are very grateful, but every now and again you get people who really get very angry at you because you did your best for them, and they wanted something else. And gratitude doesn't always come with a job.
So he needs to get out of there, and they're keeping him, and he sort of falls in with some perhaps underworld types. Tell us a little. First of all, maybe tell us about Tazara. Now this is a it's not a human species, right? This is
actually they're pretty human. They just tattoo themselves all over. I drew that from sort of Polynesian. And New Zealand Maori culture.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a sort of Maori analog.
I see. So they're really into the honor and the and when you pledge your word, it's everything. It's all. And this guy has pledged to the Lewitt. Where did he come from, and what? He's pretty deadly as well. Tell us a little bit about him, at least. That's what I mean.
Eric, yeah, that goes back to the previous book, really.
Yeah, they live on a planet that's sort of kind of Polynesian in the sense that people live on islands. They're very ferocious. They have a very ferocious culture. It's partly, well, that and the tattoos, but, that's partly what gives it a kind of Maori flavor. It's, some years ago, actually, Dave and I were both in New Zealand at the same time. We were both going to the same science fiction convention. And my wife and I went to New Zealand a week early just to have a vacation. And New Zealand's a fascinating place, but I had never known much about the Maori. But when I got there, I got very interested in the culture and the history of it. And they were ferocious as all hell. I mean, they sacked the English capital 3 times. And the thing about the Maori that's sort of striking to me was that they took the gunpowder warfare. And lots of other indigenous peoples adopted firearms, but they didn't really change their way of fighting wars. They just sort of swapped out weapons. But the Maoris just, boy, they really loved it. And they invented trench warfare, landmines. I mean,
they very nearly licked the British Empire.
Yeah, I mean, they were some seriously ferocious people. And so there's a certain definitely Maori flavor to the culture that Tazara comes from. And then some of the stuff, of course, we invented. Just, some of the specifics aren't particularly Maori.
I might say my dive partner is Maori. So I spent a lot of time with the guy, and this is the guy that I was on the bottom of the sea. He'd gone up with a bag of crays, and I was marking the place, and I was shooting fish while I was down there, probably about 15 meters down, right? So, 45 feet or so. And a shark came up and started circling me. So I'm pressing as flat as I can on the bottom, swimming back towards the boat. It obviously wants the fish that I've got, but it might just not stop at the fish. And I've got my little hand spear there. I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I spear things by hand. And this thing's circling me, and I'm trying to keep facing it, and eventually it starts getting a bit closer, and I poke it on the nose, and it rolls back its gums, and I can see all the teeth, and I'm really getting scared. And my mate jumps over the side of the boat and swims down to me. Now that's typifies the type of people you're dealing with, and a level of commitment to one's friends and partners and whatever that, just quite freaky.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. And Tazara is that kind of character. He's just fun to be around.
Absolute loyalty when it's given,
And he's smart.
He's smart and tough, but absolutely and finally loyal when the loyalty is given to you.
So they got to get back to the ship basically and get out of there. And they meet this character named Mia. Tell us about her, because she's kind of cool too, and the Lewitt is able to help her, which is a key that opens really the rest of the book.
Yeah, she's got a nasty degenerative disease and has compensated for the pain and fact that she comes from the same culture as Tazara, which is a very physical, military type culture, and there she is without legs, and she's made up for this by being absolutely scheming, absolutely conniving, and very powerfully manipulative and completely deadly, although she's confined to a wheelchair. Dealing with this degenerative disease starts to put some of the pieces of the puzzle that start on that world and deal with where the slavers get the power to do this to their slaves and the various alien creatures that got left behind by an earlier empire.
Yeah. What is the what's the thing that the benefactor that one of these is it they're from the planet Kaloth, or I believe that's what their race is called, the Tazara and Mia. What is it that it needs? The relationship needs to go both ways, and the Lewitt, when she understands that, is able to make it go both ways later in the book. What do the benefactors of who are receiving the service from these characters, what do they owe them? I just thought it was really cool the way that
I was going to say, I mean, this is definitely always a two-way relationship, and the more you put into it, the more you get out of it, basically. The idea of a loyal servitor being loyal just because he's loyal has always kind of freaked me out. I mean, loyalty has to go both ways, and the Lewitt gradually works out how the whole honor system of the clan works, and manages to bind herself into them.
There's also a really important dramatic there's actually two dramatic tasks we had to accomplish in this book. One of them centers on Goth, Paussert and Goth, who have all through the series from the very first book been at the center of it. But as the series progressed, the Lewitt becomes more and more important as you go along. Right? In the very first book, The Witches of Karres, she's a very important but definitely very secondary character. And she's about, I don't know, what would you say, Dave, 8 years old in Witches of Karres?
Yeah.
About 2 years younger than God. And one of the things we needed to do by the end of the fourth book was, in addition to resolving the relationship between Paussert and God, by that point you couldn't just leave Lewitt sitting there. I mean, she's at an age where, so we worked out where by the end of it she's on her own. And is not quite an adult, but is close enough to it that she can go off and do her own thing, which is what Witches of Karres do. But part of the reason she can do it is that she's assembled around her this team, so to speak, because Mia is now with her, and so is Tazara. So she's and Vezarn is a spacer who's been there forever since the beginning. So. One of the things we were able to do in the course of Shaman of Karres was give the Lewitt the sort of backing she needed, to be able at the end to go off and have whatever adventure she would wind up having afterwards. So that resolved that. Otherwise, we would have had a kind of big major loose end hanging out there, which we don't now. There's a resolution to her story arc, just like. And
it's kind of the novel is really kind of a coming of age story of the Lewitt. That's the
yes,
the big
yes, yeah, it is very much so.
yeah. So
Yeah, I think in a way we took all of the major characters, and although they all occur in all of the books, but each one of them is centered on the next character. I mean, Wizard of Karres obviously is on Paussert himself. Sorceress is Goth really coming to her own, or starting to come to her own, and Shaman is really about the Lewitt.
Well, I mean, it's not like Goth and Paussert aren't central to the book also.
well,
but,
let's talk about what Goth is up to, because that's a major subplot, and it's kind of cool the way that just kind of take her up to finding maybe where Lenny is, and what she does to the people who would take her prisoner and make her a slave. She doesn't take it lying down. No.
Goth doesn't take much lying down. and she's the less impulsive of the two. Paussert tends to destroy things if he has a chance.
Yeah, it's in the very first book, Schmitz makes the point at some point in the book, and something Paussert realizes that of the three sisters, Goth is the real witch of Karres. More so than her older or younger sister. There's something very witchy about Goth. And she doesn't look like the other two sisters. She actually looks more like her mother, Tall, who's a very powerful witch in her own right. And she was quite prominent, of course, in the third book, too, Sorcerer of Karres. But in this one, she's completely on her own for oh, God, what would you say, Dave? 2/3 of the book, at least.
Yeah.
And she's still very young. I mean, she's we don't specify the age exactly. I mean, she's still a teenager, but she's in late teenage years by now. But she's nobody to mess with, that's for damn sure. And the Lewitt's not really, she has a very different personality. I mean, especially by the end of this book, she's very much a healer. And she has real powers, too, but it's not the same as I don't know, both temperamentally in terms of what Goth can do. She's sort of
Well, she basically starts. These people have captured her and another girl, and they're going to sell her as a slave. And some of the things she's able to do that she may do. We don't want to give too much away, but this is really toward the beginning. She's able to go into this form called, what is it called? No substance.
Yeah. This is the whole bit about bending light around yourself, etc.
Yeah, and so she can really scare the hell out of these pirates who have, or these.
Yeah, she says she in the end deals with them much as they intended to deal with her, which I think is enough of a spoiler for the book.
And she,
when she gets to actually, there's quite a lot of that in the whole book now. It strikes me, is that very often retribution is precisely what the other person intended to do to the first character.
Yeah, it's it's an adventure, and this is the reason I say it feels like Andre Norton too, because that's what happens in a lot of her books. You get the bad guys get exactly what they were trying to do to others. But
well, we'll see.
Anyway, it's cool. I mean, I know that Eric is a great lover of Schmidt, so that we won't do too much comparison of James Schmidt.
James Schmidt, yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, I was also a big fan of Andre Norton's too.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is quite a bit of similarity between the two of them in terms of the kind of adventure. There's a different flavor to them. which is almost impossible to describe. It's just, different authors have different flavors to them, so to speak. But yeah, they're, I don't know how to put it. They have a certain kind of, a lot of their novels have a certain sort of touch of young adult, but they're not young adult. But there's, I don't know. I remember I grew up on Bo Schmitz and Andre Norton. I discovered Norton actually earlier
those
on.
Those are two of my favorite authors. So yeah, it's quite possible there's a bit of influence there.
Right. Well, if you like those, you'll certainly like this. One other thing I wanted to bring up is the very cool, what is it called? Eggers Way, the ability.
Oh yeah.
The Egger route, yeah.
And that's definitely extra dimensional travel. Refuse to call it anything else.
Which is Goth's ability to, if things get too bad, she can pull the plug in a way, but she'll also
pulling the plug can kill you.
Yeah.
And the Egger Way seems to be something that all the Karres witches can do, but each of them experiences it slightly differently. And none of them enjoy doing it very much because it's a fairly unpleasant experience. But the one thing that always seemed to be in common with it was a huge amount of vibration, which is interesting in itself.
Yeah. It's teleportation that takes you to another planet or another place.
In a way, except teleportation is usually considered to be instantaneous, and the Egger route is not instantaneous, although exactly how much time it takes is never very clear. Schmitz is the one who developed it. It appears at the very beginning, and which is not at the beginning of the book, but in the course of the Witches of Karres. So we didn't. We just stayed stuck to his.
And the Lewitt keeps being threatened with being made to swim home by the Egger Way.
Well, it's the kind of thing that seems like an out, but it's not really, because it's just going to make things more difficult.
Well, it's an out, but it's also A, it's unpleasant, and B, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
So it's not like a magic
Not
wand.
everyone who uses it gets out of the other side.
Yeah.
But that is another cool conundrum that, like the book has with the slaves. This is, you can jump out of whatever you're in, but it's it can make things far worse.
Egger route seems to only really effectively work one way.
Yeah.
You have to beam to wherever you're going to. So you can't jump to some place you've never been.
Which is the reason that Goth knows Paussert so well. That's where she would go. Yeah. So that's cool.
Right. Yeah, and the ship so well, etc. Yeah.
What else can we say about the book, without giving too much away, that we maybe haven't mentioned?
Well, I'll tell you one thing about the book that inspired me in the first place was cats. Because the relationship of a lot of the alien behavior is in fact based on the way cats manipulate their owners, and you're never entirely sure how much the cat really appreciates this, but it certainly gets its owner to do everything that it wants. So it's always a question of who the slave is in that relationship.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, what are you guys working on, Eric? What's going on?
Well, Dave and I together are not working on anything right now. What I'm working on is there's a number of projects, but the one that's at the center of everything I'm doing right now is I'm working with David Weber to write the next novel set in David's Hunter Harrington universe. And the book has the working title of Cloak of Evil, which neither David or I like, so the title will change by the time the book comes out. But it's the direct sequel to Cauldron of Ghosts, which we wrote together, but it also carries on it's a partial sequel, at least, to the last Harrington book that David wrote, with Uncompromising on it. Yeah, so it picks up some of those threads. That's what I'm working on right now. And after that, I've got a couple of projects I've got to finish up, and then the next major book I'll be writing is the third book in the Trail of Glory series. That's Sam Houston alternate history books. I'll be starting those later this year. And other than that, I'm just doing I do a lot of collaborative writing, so it's not as if my co-authors aren't, keeping me busy. At this point, most of them are now doing the first drafts, and then I follow on behind them, or sometimes we set aside parts that we're going to do. The last book, Dave wrote. I mean, really, the Shaman of Karres, Dave wrote it. It was, stuff we've been working together on for years. But it's of all the books in the series, this is really very much his. Because I came after, he sent me the manuscript, and then I did a fair amount of editing and some rewriting and so on and so forth. But it's the last book Dave and I did together, All the Plagues of Hell, but he was not able, for various reasons, to finish the book. So he sent me, most of it, but I wrote the ending, and then, which was a number of chapters, then went back and did some rewriting earlier on. So I don't know. The one thing that is we have talked about doing, but we just haven't done it, is another of the pyramid books. There are two: Pyramid Scheme, the original book, which is set in Greek and Egyptian mythology, and then Pyramid Power, which is set in Norse mythology, and then we have kicked around, although we haven't done anything in some years, doing a third book, which would be Celtic mythology. But, it's not as if we're both not busy, so I don't know when we'll get around to that.
Well, I hope you do.
Yeah.
And
The other
as
thing
far
that
as
we
the
can
Karres series
talk
go,
about.
we could write another Karres book. I mean, you can always imagine. I'm not sure we're going to, though, because
Yeah, I'm
this
not,
does really
not at this
complete
stage
the story
thinking of
arc,
Karres,
Shaman
but
of Karres.
what I have suggested to you before, Eric, was that we looked at a sequel to Demon Breed. Schmitz's.
Oh, that would be, that would be a lot of fun, actually, because I love that book. If there was any one single Schmitz story
That's
that I
probably
think
my
is his
favorite
best,
one, yeah.
it's the Demon Breed, which is a short novel. It's about 50,000 words. At the time he wrote it, that was considered novel length. It's not any longer, but it's an absolutely wonderful story, and it's set in the Federation of the Hub setting, which is another very interesting. Yeah, that would be actually very. That would be fun to write.
Yeah, and it's got quite a lot of marine stuff and a lot of biology, so yeah, sort of in my ballpark.
Oh yeah, because that's set on a water world, and I've just completed a trilogy set on a water world with Reich Spoor that just came out, in fact, last month in March. Castaway Resolution. That was the third and last of the trilogy, and that's also set on a water world. Water worlds are really interesting.
They're wet.
Yeah. And the one that Schmitz created, Nandy Klein, which is where the adventure of the Demon Breed takes place, is really got an interesting ecology and biology to it.
Cool. Well, Dave, what are you working on? You got any solo work coming up?
Yeah, I've been busy moving and building a house for most of the last year, which took up a lot more of my time and energy than I anticipated when I started. If I had any idea what I was doing, then I would never have started it. But I've been working on a couple of books at the moment. One of them is another young adult novel, which is called "And How Much for Just the Crazy Uncle," which has a premise of two kids deciding to put up an advert to sell their family on what's your American equivalent of Gumtree, Craigslist, and the unpleasant responses of people who just want to buy the crazy uncle. And the other one that I'm working on is set on a planet which has no solid air, no solid ground at all, but it has a habitable zone out in the exosphere. So it's a gas giant, and if you get high up enough, you can actually breathe the atmosphere, and there's water and oxygen to be had. And any planet like that has this minor problem: there's nothing to stand on. So there is an anti-gravity trading plate on this thing, where two hostile empires once met. Now, the hostile empires died mysteriously, but their relics still live on the trading plate and in their little cloud castles, which are showpieces of the very wealthy, drifting around this vast gas giant planet, onto which I crash landed a load of humans who were heading for a prison colony planet. So we've got an interesting mixture of Australia and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of nothing. Yeah. And I decided I would add a do-gooder into that who just sets out to uplift the poor people.
Wow.
I'm deeply impressed with the idea.
It's like Australia collides with Rendezvous with Rama. But
sounds about right, yeah.
Well, that sounds cool. You have a title for it yet, or you?
At the moment, it's got a working title of Cloud Castles, but who knows?
Well, that sounds cool. Well, out now at booksellers everywhere is The Shaman of Karres by Eric Flint and Dave Freer. Eric and Dave, thank you so much for talking with us about this really fun adventure book with a lot of really cool science fiction and sense of wonder to it.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Here is another entry in David Weber's Honor Harrington series masterpiece, Uncompromising Honor. Honor keeps her promise. The Solarian League. For hundreds of years they have borne the banner of human civilization, but the bureaucratic mandarins who rule today's League are corrupt and looking for scapegoats. They've decided the upstart Star Kingdom of Manticore must be annihilated. Uncompromising courage. Honor Harrington has worn the Star Kingdom's uniform for half a century. Very few know war the way Honor Harrington does. So far, hers has been a voice of caution. But now the Mandarins have committed atrocities such as the galaxy has not known in 1,000 years. They have finally killed too many of the people Honor Harrington loves. Uncompromising vengeance. Now Honor Harrington is coming for the Solarian League, and hell is riding in her wake. And now, David Weber's Uncompromising Honor.
Office of the Second Space Lord. Admiralty House, City of Landing, Manticore, Star Empire of Manticore. Sorry it took me so long, Pat, Hamish Alexander Harrington, Earl Whitehaven, and First Lord of Admiralty said, as he followed Commander Terry Lasseline, Admiral Patricia Givens' new Chief of Staff, through Givens' office door. Tobias Stimson, his personal armsman, peeled off outside the door. We were in transit when your message came in, so what's this all about? I assume there's a reason I'm here, instead of talking to the Select Committee where I'm supposed to be? Actually, Hamish, a familiar soprano said from the office's smart wall, I'm the one who's messed up your schedule. Sorry about that. I'm sure you're looking forward to talking to the committee almost as enthusiastically as I'm looking forward to that state dinner tonight. Honor! Whitehaven's incipient frown disappeared as he turned to face the smart wall. If you needed to talk to me, there are simpler ways to do it. I'm aware. His wife shook her head with a certain resignation as Lasseline touched Whitehaven's elbow and pointed at one of the armchairs facing the smart wall. Unfortunately, this call isn't a social occasion. There's something you need to see. Me as in First Lord, I presume? He asked, settling into the indicated chair with a nod of thanks to the commander. Lasseline smiled, then raised an eyebrow at Givens. We're good, Terry, the second Space Lord said. But grab a seat. You should hear this too. Yes, ma'am. Lasseline found a chair of her own, and Whitehaven turned his attention back to the smart wall. Honor stood at one end of her desk aboard Imperator, and he recognized Mercedes Brigham, her chief of staff, Andrea Jarowalski, her ops officer, and George Reynolds, her intelligence officer, behind her. Captain Rafe Cardonis, Imperator's CO, stood with them, and Whitehaven's eyebrows twitched slightly. That quartet represented the most trusted core of Honor's staff, and their expressions were a strange mix of eagerness and trepidation? No, that wasn't quite the right word, but it was headed in the right direction. Absolutely. One of our forensic teams pulled something very interesting out of Asali Super Dreadnought's comm records. It may shed a little light on Filaretta's actions. Of course, she grimaced, I think it probably poses as many new questions as it answers. Wonderful. He shook his head, then glanced at Givens. Seems to work that way more often than not in intelligence matters, doesn't it? Givens, who commanded the Office of Naval Intelligence in addition to her other duties, snorted, and he looked back at Honor. Show me, he said simply, and Honor looked at Reynolds. George? Yes, Your Grace. The newly promoted captain faced Whitehaven from the smart wall. My lord, what you're about to see was pulled out of a personal comm exchange between Admiral Filaretta's communications officer and the comm officer aboard Leonhard Euler. We've abstracted the relevant material, stripped away the rest of the message, and enhanced what we kept. I'd like to recommend it's Ensign now, Her Grace's authority, Elijah Demas, for some well-deserved recognition for spotting it, too. I'm not sure it would have popped the filters before we scrubbed and enhanced it. Whitehaven nodded his understanding. We don't have any visual of the critical speakers, Reynolds continued. They were outside the pickup's field of view, but the voice recognition software is 99.9% confident in its IDs. That could be a problem down the road, Hamish, Givens put in, then shrugged when he looked at her. If we go public with this, there are going to be plenty of Solis ready to point out how convenient for us it is that all we have are disembodied voices. Maybe yes, and maybe no, Pat. Honor's voice drew Givens and Whitehaven's eyes back to her. We've got all the rest of the message with this embedded in it. Anybody who wants to can do her own forensics on it. Not, she grimaced, that anyone in old Chicago's likely to be interested in determining whether or not it's genuine. You're probably right, Whitehaven said. So why don't you go ahead and show it to me? George, Honor said again, and Reynolds nodded. Then he pressed a button, and another voice spoke, against a background the Admiral and Hamish Alexander Harrington recognized only too well, the clipped, disciplined voices of a flag bridge at battle stations. Very well, it said. It sounded flat, wooden, and a caption on the smart wall identified it as Fleet Admiral Massimo Filaretta. Strike our wedges and send the pod self-destruct command, Bill. Whitehaven's eyebrows shot up, and he turned to dart an astonished glance at Givens. The Admiral only shook her head and held up an index finger. Yes, sir, another voice said, and the caption identified this one as that of Admiral William Daniels, 11th Fleet's operations officer. I suppose you should go ahead and get Harrington back, Reuben. Filaretta's voice continued. She'll want... There was another sound, one Whitehaven couldn't quite make out. It sounded almost like a muffled cry of protest, then... What the fuck do you think you're Filaretta's voice shouted. It cut off in mid-syllable, and Whitehaven's gaze moved from Givens back to Honor. That's all we've got, she said softly. but the time chops a perfect match. Filaretta's last words synchronize exactly with 11th Fleet's pod launch. We've always known the launch order came from Filaretta's flag bridge. The launch codes and sequence confirmed that. But nobody on his staff said a word to anyone outside Oppenheimer afterward. Oppenheimer was destroyed in our first wave launch, of course, but time of flight was 160 seconds, so there was ample time for them to have talked to somebody outside the flagship. And I'm particularly struck by how it breaks off so suddenly. Leonhard Euler's comm officer is the only person we know of who was in contact with Filaretta's flag bridge at that moment, and she tried for almost 3 minutes to reestablish contact, while her captain tried to find out what the heck was going on when those missiles launched. She couldn't, and that matches with everything we've heard from all of 11th Fleet's survivors. No one could raise Filaretta's flag bridge. I'm inclined to wonder if that's because something happened to it right after they launched.
But if that's really Filaretta, it sounds like he did decide to surrender, Whitehaven said.
I think that's exactly what he did, Honor said, and her voice was grim, her dark brown eyes cold. I think he understood precisely what we wanted him to understand, that his only option was to surrender. And I think the bastards on the other side of this took precautions to prevent him from doing anything of the sort.
You're saying this was another example of that killer nanotech of theirs?
It was technically a question, but it didn't sound like one. I'm saying that's exactly what it was, and that the people who planted it on him used me and my people to kill another 250,000 Solarian spacers, his wife said harshly. Nobody on Old Terra who wasn't already prepared to believe us will believe a word of it, but we know now. And these people, whoever they are running up quite a bill with me. She smiled a hexapuma smile. I'm looking forward to presenting it.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Uncompromising Honor by David Weber. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And an ugly fish that propagates by telling bad puns and making the ladyfish groan so much she squeezes her eyes shut and invites him to implant his tentacular finest. Plus, thanks and praise for Eric Flint and Dave Freer, authors of The Shaman of Karres. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.